The population on this planet reached 7 billion on this day. That's according to the United Nations Population Fund. Should we celebrate or despair? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The United Nations Population Fund set Monday, October 31st, as the symbolic date for the number of people on the planet hitting the 7 billion mark. The US Census Bureau has a different date, insisting the 7 billion threshold will not be reached until March next year. However, the UN argues that the figure has been reached earlier than expected because people are living longer, more babies are surviving, and more children are being born in the developing world. The UN also estimates that the world's population will reach 9.3 billion by 2050 and exceed 10.1 billion by the end of the century, at the same time as maintaining that these calculations are not about statistics, but about people. It was only 12 years ago that the United Nations named Bosnian Adnan Mevic as the world's 6 billionth baby. Emma Hayward recounts his story.
Adnan Mevic arrives home at his family's flat on the outskirts of Sarajevo. The birth of a child is often celebrated, but Adnan's arrival was marked far beyond Bosnia's borders. He was, after all, the 6 billionth person to be born in the world, and that brought with it instant fame.
This is me when I was little, this is Kofi Annan, and this is my mum.
The intervening years have brought the media back to the Mevic household from time to time. But fame has done little to lift the family's fortunes. Adnan's father is ill, and his mother hasn't been able to find work for 12 years. She says she feels her son has been let down.
As far as the UN is concerned, he has no support. The UN showed up then, and they haven't been seen for more than 12 years.
As the world prepares to embrace its 7 billionth baby, questions will be asked about how to sustain life on such a highly populated planet. His or her arrival will be marked with fanfare, but much like Adnan, the title won't ensure them a smooth journey in life. Emma Hayward, Al Jazeera.
And now let's have a closer look on how the world's population reached this new milestone. We got here in a hurry. In 1800, there were only 1 billion people on Earth. 2 centuries later, that number grew 6-fold. And it's only taken a decade for us to reach 7 billion. It's not going to stop. In 30 years, India is expected to have the world's largest population. China will likely come in second. The numbers in both those countries are expected to be around 1.5 billion people. Africa will keep growing too. Nigeria, the most populous country on the continent, may very well reach 400 million people by 2050. By then, the number of people living on Earth may top 9 billion. Joining us now to discuss these issues are our 3 guests. In Brussels, Nirj Deva, Vice Chairman of the European Parliament's Committee on Development. In London, Simon Ross, the Chief Executive of Population Matters. And in Nairobi, Aly Khan Satchu, a financial analyst and CEO of Rich Investments. Welcome to you all. To begin in Nairobi with Aly Khan Satchu, should we be celebrating or worrying or both?
Well, I think, it's half of one and half a dozen of the other. I think, it's time to celebrate any new human being that's born on this earth. However, we're seeing so many stress points now in terms of food prices, in terms of the environment, and especially here in East Africa, I have a sense that, we're witnessing the epicenter of global warming, which is a consequence of the enormous number of people on our planet. I, for one, am getting very worried about where we're going now. I think we're rushing headlong into a situation which is going to create more and more stress on the globe in different places. It might not happen in the developed world, but it's happening all over parts of Africa. Just take what's happening in the Horn of Africa, where clearly the land cannot sustain the number of people who are seeking to live on it.
Well, Simon Ross in London, what's your view on this?
Yes, I go along with that. I think we can see that there are serious environmental problems. Climate change is one, but there are lots of others as well. And there are concerns about resources, things like water, oil, soil degradation. And as the world industrialises and as population grows, I think we are heading for big issues ahead.
Well, Nirj Deva in Brussels, what's your opinion? Shall we be concerned or should we be celebrating this number?
Well, Ali, I think, is unduly pessimistic. It's fantastic and glorious that the 7th billion human being on earth was born in Sri Lanka, a place where I was born. But the fact is that there are stresses. Of course there are stresses on water and stresses on land, irrigation, and so on, and population going from 1.65 billion at the turn of the 20th century to 7 billion now. That's an enormous leap. But we managed, though there are billion people still under the poverty levels, we are doing incredibly well considering these huge numbers. For example, 250 million hectares of land is now being irrigated. That's 5 times the amount of land that was irrigated at the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, let's also take a look at
some to remember.
Carry on.
The thing to remember is that while much of the developing world is short of food and looking for food, much of the developed world is dieting. How much money are we spending on trying to keep fit and keep slim? So there is an imbalance in consumption.
Well, Simon Ross in London, let's go straight from that particular point. We're looking at a situation where, as we heard it expressed there, people in the Western world are dieting, people in less developed areas are suffering. This disparity in human experience, this a direct consequence of population explosion, is it?
I think the disparity is very real and it's something we do need to address. But I don't think it's an either or. I think if we are trying to think of a sustainable future, what things will be like for humanity in 100 years or 200 years, we do need to reduce the disparity, but we also need to keep bringing the birth rate down so that we don't overexploit resources. Because even things like irrigation, they're dependent on aquifers, they're dependent on glaciers, things that aren't necessarily safe and secure. So I don't think we should be complacent.
Well, Aly Khan Satchu in Nairobi, I'd like you to pick up on that particular point, that disparity between environments, between nations, between people.
Well, I think, you know, we've got this enormous disparity. We've got, I think, 1 billion people who are living barely on the poverty line. The quality of life that these people are experiencing is nothing like what people are experiencing in the Western world. And I think it's far-fetched to say we're going to equalize everybody and flatten the world and the fat people are going to become thin and the thin people become a little bit fatter. I think ultimately we watched an exponential increase in the population, and to say that we can continue on this path is completely illogical. And when I look at what we're seeing food prices move away from, move into a much higher trajectory. You know, somewhere like East Africa, food inflation is pretty much running at 30% in parts of East Africa, and it's even higher if you're on a minimum wage. So I think you've got to be really divorced from reality, not to be understanding how much pressure this extra population is bringing in certain places. It might not be bringing it to people in Europe, but it's bringing an enormous amount of pressure to bear in the periphery, in places we're not used to. In places we're not used to seeing it happen.
Well, Nirj Deva in Brussels, I'd like you to follow up on that point, the issue that the experiences...
Ali's Malthusian doom and gloom vision of the future, I don't agree with at all. The Club of Rome did this some time ago. And the fact is that the Club of Rome was proved to be wrong when they had predicted that by now we would all be starving. The fact is that technology will catch up. Africa could feed the whole world. If we make Africa the breadbasket of the world, we could feed it. But is Africa being cultivated? Of course not. The simple thing is that if we want to cultivate Africa, get it to be the biggest agro-industry in the world, like Brazil has done, with sustainable agricultural development, it can be done. But it requires property rights, it requires good soil condition practices, it requires sustainable development, it requires local access and local markets, it requires distribution. Look at all the fruit in Africa, Ali, that's just falling out of trees and rotting on the side of roads, not picked up. Look at all the cattle and beef that are not processed.
Aly Khan Satchu.
Right now, a great deal of land is being given away in Africa on egregious long-term contracts where somebody is lining their pocket. And when you look at the contract that's being struck, which is being struck for 50 years, 75-year leases, it makes no economic sense. Therefore, to say that Africa can be the breadcast, sure it can. Congo could be Brazil next year, but it's not going to be, because we have a world in which we live in which the politicians have a huge sway and the circumstances we meet are not utopian. So somewhere like Africa, you know, of course, it could free the whole world, but it's not going to. And you know, and to say that cows are all over the place, I've seen cows dying. 2 droughts in 2 years. I drove through the city of Nairobi and cows were expiring with their last breath because there was no water. So I accept the point we can increase production, but there is a finite limit to what we can do, and the way we find the world in which we live, it's very, very different to that utopian idea that everybody can produce the maximum potential.
Well, Simon Ross in London, would you like to adjudicate on these 2 points of view that we're hearing here?
I think we could certainly increase production for sure. We could reduce waste, we could have more intensive agriculture. But there are problems. That sort of agriculture requires high inputs of water and oil, and we have limited amounts of water in the ground, and climate change is coming along, and we'll have less oil in the future than we do today. So and the other thing is that intensive agriculture creates its own problems. It degrades the soil, it makes pests most likely. So this optimistic view that we can just produce vastly more amounts of food, I think is highly doubtful. I think we have to, yes, go along that route to some extent, but we should also try and slow population growth at the same time, because the real question is, how do we get these 1 or 2 or 3 billion people who are very poor, how do we improve their living standards? And we can only do that if we reduce our overall numbers.
Well, let's take a look at that particular point. Is that it is, interestingly enough, that population growth is actually slowing according to the statistics. What we're looking at, for example, is that there's been a drop in fertility rates. The number of children a woman is expected to have in her childbearing years has dropped from 6 about 40 years ago to 2.5 now. So actually, there are a drop in population rates. Nirj Deva, despite this, do you think that the issue still has to be addressed in the actual size of the population and the rate at which it increases?
There are issues which are very important to consider. I'm not that much concerned about population growth, as more concerned about accidents, hurricanes, floods. Now take, for example, the Himalayas. The Himalayas range feeds the great rivers which feed 1.5 billion people. But the acceleration of the glacier melt on the Himalayas because of black carbon is so fast, 4 times as fast as we expected, that there are now 3,000 lakes, artificial lakes created at the base of these mountains, 300 of which are reckoned to be dangerous and could break out and flood outlying villages. If these flash floods created by accelerated melting of the glacier melt creates water shortages on the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Yellow River, the Dari, and all the rivers in the Punjab, we are sunk. 1.5 billion people will starve. Now, the only way to get this sorted out is for the countries in the region to sit down together around the table. That is China, India, Pakistan, Bhutan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. Will they sit down together? Well, that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, but
I got
looking
a report through Parliament
if I may,
week.
Nirj Deva, but looking at the wider issue of this, we heard Aly Khan Satchu referring a little bit earlier to climate change, for example. Now, climate change, we know, is connected to the emission of greenhouse gases. It's the countries in the West, the developed countries, that are most responsible for this, whereas those in the least developed nations are the countries that are suffering. The two droughts that Aly Khan Satchu mentioned there, for example. But I'd like to put that to you in Nairobi, Aly Khan Satchu. That issue of climate change, for example, there is a responsibility globally which may not be taken at the present.
If I can come back to exactly that, I think there is a huge responsibility for the developed countries to come to the support of the developing countries, but they're not going to come to the support of the developing countries in any meaningful scale and right what has been a historical situation. You know, we live in a world where countries do not act altruistically, they act, very selfishly, and especially in these sort of very broad brush things where countries in the developing world are saying, look how much you've polluted us, and look how it's affecting the Horn of Africa. The connection is not clear to people. It's not there. It isn't enough of a rallying cry to get these countries to feel guilty and actually put their hand in their pocket. So I just think we're trying to herd cats here, and it's going to be very, very difficult to get countries to act in concert and for the greater good. I think we live in an environment where people are going to look at their own selfish interest and look at what they can do there. And that's another problem with the food market. The food market is entirely asymmetric. The moment there's a food shortage, everybody starts hoarding. You might have enormous supplies in warehouses, but it's not going to leave the warehouse. So you're going to still have the problem somewhere else.
Well, Simon Ross in London, I'd like you to follow up on that particular point of a global responsibility not being exercised, perhaps.
I think that's true. We shouldn't be talking about growth rates, I think, but numbers. Since I was born, the population, of course, has gone up from 3 to 7 billion, and it's going to probably grow by another 40%, 10 billion by 2085. The cost of providing family planning and empowering women in developing countries is really a matter of 3-4 billion. It's not a vast amount of money per annum, and I think that money would be well spent if it really started bringing numbers, because although population on its own doesn't solve the problems, it does make them easier to solve.
Well, Nirj Deva, what's your opinion on that particular point?
Let me just come back to the point that Ali made. Yes, global warming is creating a great catastrophes around the world. But the point I made about 1.5 billion people being at risk is not caused by global warming. It's man-made. Carbon black, which is soot from wood stoves, is depositing on the snow. And when you have black snow stuff on the snow, it melts faster, as you know. And when it melts faster, the water comes sweeping down and creates all these problems. So this is something that the countries are concerned about. These matters can stop using wood burning stoves and charcoal stoves.
This brings us, Nirj Deva, it brings us, Nirj Deva, to the issue of fossil fuels, for example, which I'd like to put to Simon Ross in London. Once again, this massive use of fossil fuels, while there's a growing global population, there's lessening resources, and in one of those resources that is lessening is, of course, fossil fuel.
Absolutely. We don't really have a substitute for fossil fuels. There's nothing that's safe and acceptable that can replace it. We know that there are problems with biofuels, with nuclear, and so on. So much of world agriculture depends on oil, particularly for irrigation, for fertilizer production, for harvesting and so on, for storage and distribution. Once we're past peak oil, once we start running down and prices start rising of fossil fuels, I think there'll be a real problem in food production, and it will continually push the prices up, particularly for the poor.
Well, let's just take a look at this particular point at a glass half full rather than what we've been doing, which is a glass half empty, perhaps. And that is that the life expectancy in the early 1950s was 48. In the first decade of this century, it is 68. That's a massive increase. Infant deaths have plunged from 133 in 1,000 in 1950 to 46 per thousand now. Aly Khan Satchu in Nairobi, surely this is a cause for some form of celebration, that there is a degree of human resilience and change for better?
I think it's wonderful that everybody is living longer, and I completely accept your point. I'm grateful that people are living longer, and I congratulate everybody on that achievement. But the mathematical point is we have more people on this earth living longer, which is putting more of a strain on the Earth's resources. If you just have to multiply the number of people by the number of years, go back and do the same mathematical equation 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and you can see the pressure is piling up exponentially on the Earth's resources. So I accept the point. I celebrate having 7 billion souls all over the world sharing this Earth with me, but I just question whether these 7 billion who are now living longer and longer are surely putting more and more pressure on the environment in which we live.
Nirj Deva in Brussels, your view on this slightly contentious issue, it would appear.
Yes, well, of course, we can't, as populations get better off, their rate of reproduction slows. And we've seen that. You said 6.5, now 2.5 on average. And with better medical health, better pension schemes, better old people's care, the less and less children will be produced. Some very poor countries produce lots of children as an insurance policy. As they get older, they have someone to look after them. But if the state comes in with the proper pension systems and the structures and governance, we can address these problems as we have done in the West and in the middle-income countries. It's just a matter of will. Now, somebody said about the Congo and Africa that it's very poorly governed. Much of Africa is very poorly governed. That is why we have problems. What we need to do is to increase the resources for good governance, for transparency, less corruption, and to put in place the laws that would give people property rights, property transactions, and do in Africa what we have done in the West. Repeat what we have done in the West in the developing countries.
Well, Simon Ross in London, what's your view of that particular point, that the least developed countries should be taking a lead from the developed West?
I think we really do have a responsibility here in the West to help those countries develop and industrialise. And over time, that will lead to a reduction in birth rate and, of course, better living standards. But what we should do simultaneously is provide them with the family planning support to help them manage their own fertility, because I think characteristically, there's a lack of joined-up thinking, a short-termism, if you like, that we work very hard to reduce infant mortality and increase longevity, but we don't always think what the impact of that extra population is going to be. So I think we need to think long-term as well as short-term, and work on our numbers as well as work on development.
Well, Aly Khan Satchu, what do you think of that particular point, a better governance within the least developed parts of the world, for example, as a way in dealing with this population increase?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the nirvana we're all looking for. I mean, across the continent of Africa, I think there's an immediate translation if we can get better governance. And I think it's going to be a sine qua non, because the more you've got all these young people coming onto the workforce, demanding a better life, and we're already seeing the consequences of these demands across the Maghreb, where we've seen 3 regimes overthrown in a very, very short space of time. So I think, if we are not going to drop into what is the worst case scenario, which is a level of insecurity and fighting over resources, civil war, all that kind of thing, then we have to deliver a system which gives more people a share of the cake. But at the same time, we're watching an increase in the number of people who want a share of that cake. Now, I'm not convinced we can expand the cake quick enough to meet the demands of this extra population. So I'd agree with you. We've got to find methods of cajoling and helping these governments and regimes to achieve what they've got to achieve, which is deliver a better life for as many people as they can. And that's why in some places all this sectarianism is a nonsense argument, because it's irrelevant whether people are Christian or Muslim or whatever. You've just got to deliver a better life for all of them.
Well, Simon
and you've got
Ross,
to do it very quickly.
If I may, Simon Ross in London, very briefly. Is it possible to create a better life for all?
I think it is, and I think if we're talking in concrete terms, what can the EU do to help this along? I think it's, fund family planning and fund women's empowerment. Those are really the major things that can be done to keep numbers down and help people develop.
Well, on that note, thank you so much to our guests, Nirj Deva in Brussels, Simon Ross in London, and Aly Khan Satchu in Nairobi. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.com. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.